The year was 1874, and the smell of ether clung to the rafters of Blackthorn Asylum like a ghost that refused to leave. The corridors were long, narrow things, veins of rotting wood and stone, pulsing faintly with the lamplight of orderlies who moved like pale insects in the dark. Dr. Adrian Vale, chief surgeon and lecturer in experimental anatomy, had long since stopped noticing the smell. It had lived in his nostrils for so many years that it might as well have been his own blood. Tonight, however, the silence had changed. The asylum was too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against the skull until it begins to hum. Vale stood before the dissecting table in his private laboratory, his breath fogging the lantern glass. The subject lay uncovered, a man of 30, a vagrant brought from the city morgue. His chest was open like a grotesque book, pages of tissue and sinew folded aside by metal retractors. But Adrian was not looking at the corpse. He was looking at the door on the far end of the room. It was smaller than the others, made of blackened oak, framed by old stone that didn't belong to the asylum's architecture. No handle, no lock, no record in any blueprint. The plaster around it seemed older than the walls themselves, like a scar in the building's skin. He called it the 9th door, and he could feel it watching him. Adrian had first noticed the door 2 months earlier, on a night much like this one. He'd been working late, his mind humming from the opium-laced tea he'd started drinking to combat the tremors in his hands. He turned, looking for the cupboard that held his instruments, and found the black door where no door had ever been. At first, he assumed he was hallucinating. Sleep deprivation, morphine exposure, the usual afflictions of genius. But the next night, it was still there, and every night since, the door had moved slightly closer to the operating table. He turned to his journal, the pages stained with fingerprints and dried blood. The 9th door manifests under conditions of silence. It appears to respond to death. It seems to absorb attention, drawing the eye even when one resists. I believe it to be a psychological threshold, a manifestation of consciousness pressing against its own limits. He dipped his pen again. Tonight, I will attempt contact. A scream echoed faintly down the corridor. A patient, likely one of the new arrivals. The sound barely stirred Adrian. Madness was the heartbeat of Blackthorn. He set down the pen and approached the corpse. The body's open chest cavity was still wet, reflecting candlelight in pulsing amber hues. Adrian's scalpel trembled slightly in his hand. "Speak," he whispered to no one. "Tell me what you see beyond it." He closed his eyes. Silence. But then, a heartbeat. Faint. Impossible. The corpse's heart, flayed and motionless a moment before, quivered. Just once. A shudder like something remembering how to live. Adrian's eyes flew open. He stumbled backward, knocking over the lantern. The light flared, throwing his shadow across the wall, long, distorted, and for a second that shadow wasn't his. The shape had no eyes. Its mouth stretched far too wide. Adrian froze. The black door was now half open. He didn't remember walking to it. One moment he was standing by the table. The next his hand was pressed against the cold wood. The air that seeped through the narrow crack was wrong. Too dense, too still, like the breath of something buried. Inside, there was no light, but he could hear something. Not sound exactly, but the pressure of many whispers layered atop each other, murmuring at the edge of meaning. A hand brushed his shoulder. He spun, scalpel raised, but there was no one there. The corpse on the table had changed position. Its head now faced the door. Its eyes were open. Adrian's pulse quickened. He stepped back from the threshold. "Not yet," he muttered. "Not yet. We'll open you properly." He slammed the lantern upright and returned to his notes, forcing his mind back into discipline. The next morning, the staff found him asleep on the laboratory floor. The corpse gone, the black door vanished. When questioned, he said only, the experiment was incomplete. But in the days that followed, something began to rot within the asylum's walls. It started with the animals. Rats dissected for neurological studies found rearranged in their cages, their eyes replaced with tiny glass marbles. Then the patients began muttering the same phrase during their fits. The doctor found the door. The door found the doctor. By the end of the week, one orderly had gouged out his own ears. Adrian's condition worsened. He stopped eating. He spent hours standing where the door used to be, pressing his palm against the wall. He told himself he was chasing knowledge, not madness. But the lines were starting to blur. One night, he carved open another subject, a young woman found drowned in the Thames. As he cut, the hum returned, the silence deepened, and the door came back. This time, it was larger. He turned toward it, blood dripping from his gloves, and whispered, "Show me what lies beyond the anatomy of silence." The whispers answered. They spoke in the voice of his own mother, dead for 20 years. "Adrian, why did you leave the door open?" He dropped the scalpel. The woman's body on the table convulsed violently. Ribs snapped outward like fingers breaking through skin. Veins bulged, pulsing in patterns that looked like symbols, the same ancient sigil carved above the doorframe. He stayed, unable to move, as something crawled out of her. Not a creature, not flesh, a reflection. It looked like him, but hollowed, its eyes black wells of ink. It smiled and whispered, "You've already crossed, Doctor." Adrian screamed, but no sound left his mouth. The room had swallowed it whole. When he woke, he was alone again. The corpse was gone. The door was closed. But his own reflection, in the blood-smeared mirror, did not move when he did. Later that month, the asylum's director, Sir Alden Finch, documented the incident in his ledger. Dr. Adrian Vale found deceased in his laboratory. Cause undetermined. Walls of the dissection room appear warped. Plaster has absorbed considerable organic matter. Doorframe at the east end sealed by unknown means. He signed the page and closed the book. Behind him, faintly, something knocked from inside the wall. 9 times. They buried Dr. Adrian Vale beneath the east garden of Blackthorn Asylum, though no priest dared speak the rites. The ground were frozen, and the workmen said the soil hissed when their shovels struck it, as if it breathed. A month later, the asylum began to change. The walls seemed to perspire at night, slick with moisture that smelled faintly of iron. Patients whispered in their sleep, murmuring the doctor's name as though he were making his rounds again. Lamps flickered whenever anyone walked near the east wing, and the cold never left those holes, even when fires were lit. The asylum was a place accustomed to madness. But this was different. This was memory turning against the living. One, the new doctor. When Dr. Elias Harrow arrived, the fog clung so thickly to the carriage that the driver lost a path twice. Elias had been summoned by the Board of Medicine to take over Blackthorn's research programs, to restore order after the unfortunate demise of Dr. Vale. He had studied Vale's papers before coming. They were feverish, filled with sketches of hearts and lungs that seemed to morph into doorways, with phrases underlined in crimson ink. Silence is a threshold. Breath is a key. Harrow told himself that genius and insanity often shared a border. But as the carriage rolled up to the iron gates, he saw something that made him tighten his grip on his satchel. The main gate was sealed shut by a chain that wasn't metal. It looked like veins, dark and hardened, running into the stone as if grown from it. The caretaker refused to speak of it. "Best not to look too long," he muttered, leading Elias through a side entrance. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, humming faintly like a hell breath. 2. Echoes in the ward. Harrow's quarters were adjacent to the old laboratory. He'd been warned not to enter it. The east wing's been sealed, they said, but the smell of formalin and dust drew him there all the same. He found the door barred, yet when he placed his hand upon the frame, the faintest pulse answered him from the wood. He withdrew quickly. "Nerves," he whispered, "just the nerves." That night, the first dream came. He dreamed of Adrian Vale, standing at the foot of his bed. His coat was soaked as though he had climbed out of the river. In his hand he held a lantern that gave off no light, only sound, a deep, rhythmic sighing. "We were so close," Vale whispered. "Don't let it close, Elias. Don't let it close." When Elias awoke, his room smelled of antiseptic and something else, faint, human breath. 3. The recordings. Curiosity gnawed at him. Within days, he broke the seal to Vale's laboratory. The room was half collapsed from damp, filled with broken glass and forgotten instruments. But at the far wall, behind a torn curtain, he found a strange device, a phonograph, surrounded by cylinders labeled Experiment 9. He wound it carefully. The wax hissed, then Vale's voice filled the silence, thin, shaking, but clear. The lungs continue to move long after cessation. A breath is not a reflex, it is memory. Perhaps the body remembers living. Perhaps consciousness is stored within the air itself. I have heard it, the breath of the dead. It called from behind the ninth door. The recording ended in static that almost sounded like breathing. Elias sat for a long time, listening to that empty sound. He didn't notice, at first, that his own breath had begun to match its rhythm. 4. The whispers returned. The patients grew restless. One by one, they began to complain of the noise, a low hum behind the walls, a feeling of lungs expanding where none should. One woman, a mute sempstress committed for melancholia, began drawing circles on her bedsheets with charcoal, 9 concentric rings, each one darker than the last. When Harrow asked her what they meant, she wrote on the wall with her trembling finger, "The door is breathing." He ordered the markings scrubbed away, but that night every wall in the ward bore the same rings. 5. The air changes. A week later, Harrow noticed the asylum's candles no longer burned clean. The flames bent toward the east corridor, as if drawn by an unseen current. He followed them. The air grew colder, denser. He reached the end of the corridor where the wall met a sealed arch of black oak. He knew at once what it was, the place where Vale's door had once stood. The surface looked alive. With each breath Elias took, the grain of the wood seemed to move slightly, as though inhaling with him. He backed away slowly, heart hammering. Behind the door, something exhaled. 6. The experiment resumes. That night he couldn't sleep. Vale's voice echoed through his thoughts. Breath is a key. On impulse, he retrieved one of the preserved cadavers from the morgue and carried it to the laboratory. He told himself it was research, a test to disprove the doctor's madness. He connected the bellows to the lungs and began to pump. The air moved through the chest cavity with a dull whistle, stirring dust from the ribs. At first nothing happened. Then, faintly, he felt the air push back. He froze. The bellows moved once more, on their own, and the corpse's mouth opened with a soft sigh. No sound, just a faint displacement of air, like a word that refused to form. He stepped closer. The breath touched his face, warm, human, and filled with the scent of the river. 7. The return. The next morning, the staff found Harrow sitting beside the dissecting table, eyes wide, unmoving. He was breathing slowly, in perfect rhythm with the bellows. When they tried to move him, the corpse on the table shuddered and released one final breath. The lamps flickered, and every window in the ward cracked from the pressure. That evening, the old black door was seen again at the end of the east corridor. The asylum's caretaker swore it hadn't been there the day before. The sigil glowed faintly in the dark. 8. The record ends. Weeks later, a letter arrived at the London Medical Society, written in Elias Harrow's precise hand. The lungs remember the silence between worlds. I have heard it whisper the names of those who were never born. The ninth door opens not into death, but into awareness itself. When you hear the breath, do not answer. There was no signature. Blackthorn Asylum was abandoned within the year. The fog grew so dense that no one could find the road again. But sometimes, travelers say, when the wind rises across the moors, you can hear it, the slow, deliberate inhalation of something that has not yet decided whether it is alive. The wind had changed over the moors. It came now from the east, cold and metallic, carrying with it the faint odor of damp stone and iron. Villagers in the nearest hamlet began to wake in the night, clutching their chests, unable to breathe. When dawn came, they spoke of hearing a faint heartbeat pulsing in the fog, steady as a tide. Most blamed the weather or bad dreams. But the old ones whispered of Blackthorn Asylum, shuttered these many months, its walls breathing still beneath the moss. And somewhere inside that ruin, a single lantern still burned. One, the return. A carriage rolled up the overgrown drive one gray morning. Its passenger was a young physician named Dr. Clara Wynne, former student of Elias Harrow. She had come in search of him after his letters had stopped. The asylum loomed like a monument to exhaustion, windows hollow, doors swollen from rain. She forced the main gate open, the rust screaming like a warning. The air was wrong here. Too thick. When she breathed, it felt as though the air pressed back against her lungs, resisting entry. "Just nose," she whispered, echoing a phrase she'd once heard from Harrow himself. Inside, The silence was total. No wind, no insects, only that faint pulsing, slow, deliberate, like the world remembering how to move. 2. The journal. She found Harrow's quarters easily. The door was half-hinged, papers scattered like shed feathers. The last page of his notebook bore a trembling hand. The breath carries thought. The heart only follows. When both fall silent, listen closely. Something else begins to beat. Clara read those words again and again, until she thought she could almost hear them, beating faintly inside her skull. She turned the page and froze. Someone had drawn a heart there, realistic, anatomical. But instead of veins, 9 small doorways branched from it, each marked with a sigil. The 9th door at the bottom was shaded black. 3. The corridor of echoes. Moving deeper into the asylum, she found that certain doors were locked not by keys but by sound. When she knocked on one, the echo came back late, like the building had taken a moment to consider the question before answering. Another opened on its own when she whispered Vale's name. The corridor beyond smelled faintly of ether and river water. She reached the eastern end and stopped. There it was, the black oak door. The sigil above it flickered faintly red, like the pulse of something sleeping. She pressed her hand against it and felt the unmistakable thrum of a heartbeat, slow, deliberate, impossibly large. 4. The heart room. The door opened soundlessly. Behind it lay a vast chamber that could not have existed within the building's dimensions. The walls pulsed faintly, the air damp and rhythmic. It felt less like a room and more like the inside of a giant chest cavity. In the center stood a suspended shape, veiled in shadow. As she stepped closer, she saw that it was not hanging, it was floating. A heart, human-sized, beating faintly in the stale air, each throb sending tremors through the floor. Something moved within it. Shapes, faces, fragments of people she almost recognized. Harrow, Vale, others. Their mouths moved in silence, their eyes fixed on her. She tried to speak, but the moment she opened her mouth, her own heartbeat faltered, skipping one rhythm behind the pulse in the room. Then another. Then it matched. The world tilted. 5. The voice in the pulse. The sound began as a murmur, deep within the blood-like air. You have come to listen. The voice was neither male nor female. It felt like pressure behind her eyes. Clara steadied herself. What are you? The silence between hearts, it said. The space that remembers when life forgets. The chamber shuddered. The pulse quickened. She realized with growing terror that it was borrowing her heartbeat, sinking to her rhythm until she could no longer tell which was hers. Her vision blurred. In the shadows of the pulsing walls, she saw 9 figures, each stepping forward through faintly glowing doorways. Each figure was a reflection of someone who had entered the asylum before her. At the center, the 9th one bore her own face. It whispered, with her own voice. The door does not open outward, Clara. It opens inward. 6. The realization. Her chest constricted. Panic surged. She stumbled backward, but the door she had entered through was gone. Only the rhythmic walls remained, expanding and contracting as though they were breathing for her. Harrow's last words echoed in her mind. When both fall silent, listen closely. She closed her eyes, forced herself to hold her breath. The pulse around her slowed, then stopped. In that absolute stillness, something revealed itself, like the quiet between 2 waves. A memory, a voice, her own, but older. You were always part of this. She gasped and the world snapped back. The heart was gone. In its place lay the remains of the asylum's foundation, cold stone, dust, and faint etchings of the symbol. She was outside again, the morning light weak and colorless. Had she dreamed it? She pressed a trembling hand to her chest. Her pulse was steady, too steady. Each beat carried a faint echo, as though another heart, far away, were answering. 7. The 9th. Clara left the asylum that day, sealing the gate behind her. But as she walked down the road, the rhythm of her steps began to fall in perfect time with her heartbeat. 1, 2, 1, 2. She stopped. The echo continued for a moment, then faded. She looked back. The fog was rising again around the asylum, thick and deliberate, forming slow circles, 9 of them, each pulsing faintly red before vanishing into the mist. When she reached the village, no one recognized her name. In the mirror of the inn, her reflection smiled a moment later than she did. And when she pressed her hand to her chest, the heartbeat came not from within but from behind her, as though something inside the silence had learned how to live.